The digging began on March the 3rd, 1886, and by sundown, Henrik Dahlberg had displaced 14 cubic yards of Kansas clay from the perimeter of his newly constructed cabin. The hole was 3 feet wide and already 4 feet deep, running in a perfect rectangle 8 feet from his cabin walls on all sides. By the following morning, word had reached the settlement at Cottonwood Falls, 12 miles southeast, that the Swede on the Flint Hills claim had finally lost his mind. The consensus among the 37 families who comprised the loosely connected farming community was unanimous and swift. Henrik Dahlberg was building his own grave, and he was building it in the most peculiar shape anyone had ever seen. They called it Dahlberg's Folly before he had finished the first day's work. They would call it something else entirely by the time May arrived, but that recognition would come at a cost that several families would pay in ways they could never have anticipated when they stood at the edge of his excavation and laughed at the methodical Scandinavian who simply kept digging while they offered their opinions on his sanity. Henrik Dahlberg had arrived in Kansas Territory in the autumn of 1884, traveling alone from the copper mining regions of Falun, Sweden, where his family had worked the underground passages for 4 generations. His father, Eric Dahlberg, had died in a tunnel collapse in 1881, and his mother had followed within the year, leaving Henrik with a small inheritance, a comprehensive understanding of underground construction, and absolutely no desire to spend another day beneath the Swedish earth that had claimed his family. America promised open sky and horizontal land, and Henrik had found both in the rolling grasslands of the Flint Hills, purchasing 160 acres of treeless prairie that most settlers considered marginal due to its exposure and the rocky limestone that lurked beneath the thin topsoil. What Henrik saw was something different. He saw land that reminded him of the high meadows above Falun, exposed and windswept, where the old miners had learned centuries ago that survival meant going down, not up. The surface was where danger lived. Safety was always below. His first year on the claim had been educational in ways that confirmed every instinct his Swedish upbringing had instilled. The winter of 1884 to 1885 brought blizzards that killed 17 settlers across Chase County, their bodies found in the spring thaw within yards of their own doors, disoriented by whiteout conditions that turned familiar homesteads into unmarked graves. Henrik had survived by digging a snow trench from his cabin door to his well, a simple precaution that his neighbors considered excessive until they counted their dead. But it was the spring that truly opened his eyes to what Kansas could deliver. On April 18, 1885, a tornado touched down 11 miles northwest of his claim, traveling for 43 minutes across open prairie before dissipating near the Neosho River. Henrik had watched it from his cabin door, a column of rotating darkness that seemed to connect the earth to something angry in the sky. And in that moment, he understood that he had not escaped the underground after all. The underground had simply followed him, because the underground was where survivors lived when the surface turned hostile. The miners of Falun had known this truth for generations. The settlers of Kansas were learning it one dead family at a time. The cabin he constructed during the summer of 1885 was unremarkable in its above-ground appearance. A 16 by 20-foot structure of locally quarried limestone with a sod roof reinforced by oak beams he had shipped from Missouri at considerable expense. What made the cabin unusual was invisible from the surface. Henrik had excavated a root cellar beneath the entire footprint of the structure, 8 feet deep, with limestone walls 18 inches thick, and a ceiling of oak planks covered by 2 feet of packed earth. So the cellar was accessible through a trapdoor in the cabin floor, but also through a tunnel that emerged 30 feet from the structure, concealed by a hinged wooden cover disguised as a chicken coop floor. This secondary entrance was not for convenience, it was for survival. Henrik had seen enough tunnel collapses to know that a single exit was the same as no exit when debris blocked your path. His neighbors noticed the chicken coop and the unusual amount of excavated soil around his property, but they attributed it to the Swede's strange habits and his unfamiliarity with proper Kansas farming techniques. They did not know about the cellar, they did not know about the tunnel, and they certainly did not understand what Henrik meant when he mentioned, casually, that his cabin was merely the beginning of a larger project that would take him most of the following year to complete. The project revealed itself on that March morning in 1886, when Henrik began digging what he called the peripheral passage system. The design was based on something his grandfather had described from the oldest copper mines in Fallon, a ring tunnel that encircled the main shaft, providing alternative escape routes, ventilation pathways, and staging areas for equipment and supplies. Henrik's adaptation translated these principles to tornado survival. The peripheral passage would be a continuous underground corridor, 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, running in a complete rectangle around his cabin at a distance of 8 feet from the foundation. The passage would connect to his existing root cellar through 4 separate tunnels, one at each cardinal direction. The passage would also include 3 surface access points, each emerging at a different location around his property, each concealed beneath functional structures: the existing chicken coop to the east, a planned woodshed to the west, and a livestock shelter to the north. The cabin itself would serve as the 4th access point through the original trapdoor. When completed, the system would provide Henrik with the ability to enter or exit his underground refuge from any of 4 directions, to move around his entire property without exposing himself to surface conditions, and to store supplies in distributed locations that could not all be destroyed by a single event. The mathematics were straightforward. Yes, the perimeter of the passage system would be approximately 144 linear feet. At 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep, this represented 3,456 cubic feet of excavation, or roughly 128 cubic yards of material. At his established pace of 14 cubic yards per day, the excavation alone would require 9 days of continuous work. The limestone reinforcement of the walls would require another 3 weeks. The roof structure, consisting of oak beams covered by limestone slabs and 2 feet of packed earth, would require an additional month. The connecting tunnels to the central cellar would add another week each. Henrik estimated the total project time at 4 months of steady labor, completing in early July, well before the following spring's tornado season. He did not account for the interruptions that his neighbors would provide, though perhaps he should have anticipated that any visible deviation from established practice would draw attention on a frontier where conformity was often mistaken for wisdom. The first visitor arrived on the afternoon of March 3rd, before Henrik had finished his initial day's excavation. Samuel Hutchins was a 53-year-old farmer from Tennessee who had settled his claim in 1879 and considered himself the informal authority on proper homesteading technique in the Cottonwood Falls vicinity. He rode up on a gray mare that was nearly as old as he was, dismounted with the deliberate movements of a man whose joints had been abused by decades of physical labor, and walked to the edge of Henrik's excavation without offering any greeting. He stood there for nearly 3 minutes, studying the precise rectangular cut in the earth, or the methodical piles of clay organized by moisture content for later use as mortar, and the Swede himself, who continued working without acknowledging his visitor's presence. Finally, Samuel Hutchins spoke. "I've buried 2 wives and a son in Kansas soil," he said. "Never once did I dig a hole that fancy for any of them. What exactly are you building here, Dahlberg?" Henrik straightened, leaned on his shovel, and considered the question with the same careful attention he gave to every problem. "I am building a passage that will allow me to survive what Kansas sends," he replied. "The tornadoes here are not so different from the cave-ins in Phelan. Both kill the man who has only one way out." Samuel Hutchins stared at him for a long moment, and then shook his head with the weary disappointment of a man who had seen too many greenhorns make too many mistakes. "Tornadoes don't care about your passages," he said. "Tornadoes care about where you're standing when they decide to come through. You want to survive a tornado? You pray it misses you. You don't dig a ditch around your house like you're preparing for a siege." Henrik nodded politely. "That is one approach," he said. "I prefer mathematics to prayer. Prayer has a variable success rate. Mathematics works every time if the calculations are correct." Samuel Hutchins left without another word, but Henrik could hear him laughing before he had mounted his horse. By the end of the first week, Henrik had received visits from 11 different neighbors, each offering variations on the same assessment. Thomas Garrett, a 41-year-old farmer from Ohio, calculated that Henrik was wasting enough labor to plant an additional 20 acres of wheat. Margaret Lindsay, a widow who ran a successful cattle operation 3 miles to the south, suggested that the excavation would fill with water during the first heavy rain and breed mosquitoes that would plague the entire county. Jacob and Ruth Steinberg, German immigrants who had arrived the same year as Henrik and should perhaps have understood his perspective better than most, warned that the exposed excavation would attract snakes and rodents that would eventually invade his cabin. Elijah Crane, a 67-year-old patriarch who had survived the border wars and considered himself immune to any threat Kansas could offer, so simply called it foolishness and suggested that Henrik was suffering from some form of European melancholy that manifested as excessive digging. The most persistent critic was a young farmer named William Dunn, 28 years old, recently married, who had built his cabin 3 miles northwest of Henrik's claim and who seemed personally offended by the Swedes' unusual construction methods. William Dunn visited 4 times during the first month of excavation, each time bringing new objections and increasingly specific predictions of failure. "The walls will collapse by summer," he announced on his second visit. "You don't understand Kansas clay. It doesn't hold like the rock you're used to in Sweden. One good rain and that whole trench fills in on itself." Henrik pointed to the limestone slabs he had already begun positioning along the completed sections. "The walls are reinforced," he said, 18 inches of limestone, mortared with the same clay you say will not hold. The weight of the earth presses inward against the stone. The stone distributes the pressure evenly. The passage will not collapse. William Dunn examined the stonework with evident skepticism. "And when a tornado comes through and tears your cabin off its foundation, what then? You'll be buried in your own hole with no one to dig you out." Henrik smiled slightly, the first expression of amusement anyone had seen from him since his arrival in Kansas. "That is precisely why the passage connects to 4 different exits," he said. "If one is blocked, I use another. If 2 are blocked, I still have 2 remaining. The tornado would need to strike all 4 exit points simultaneously to trap me. The mathematical probability of that occurrence is negligible." William Dunn left shaking his head, but he returned 2 weeks later with the same objections, as if repetition might eventually prove his point. If you find value in these accounts of practical wisdom tested by extreme conditions, I would ask you to consider subscribing to this channel and sharing these stories with others who might benefit from them. The knowledge preserved in these narratives comes from people who paid for their understanding in ways that textbooks cannot replicate, and that knowledge deserves to survive beyond the individual lifetimes that earned it. A subscription costs nothing but ensures that these lessons continue to reach new audiences who might one day face similar challenges. The mathematics of survival do not change, even when the context does. The excavation progressed according to Henrik's schedule, despite the interruptions. By April 15th, he had completed the full perimeter trench and begun the limestone reinforcement of the walls. By May 1st, the walls were finished, and he had started on the oak beam ceiling structure. By May 20th, the ceiling was in place, and he was packing the earthen cover that would complete the passage. The 4 connecting tunnels to his central cellar were excavated simultaneously, each one emerging into the passage at a 90-degree angle, reinforced with the same limestone construction that characterized the rest of the system. The 3 surface access points were integrated into structures that served legitimate agricultural purposes, drawing no additional attention from neighbors who had already dismissed the project as eccentricity. The chicken coop to the east housed 37 laying hens that provided Henrik with eggs for his own consumption and for trade at the Cottonwood Falls General Store. The woodshed to the west stored 4 cords of oak firewood, enough to last 2 winters, even in the most severe conditions. The livestock shelter to the north protected 2 dairy cows and a mule from summer heat and winter storms. None of his neighbors suspected that each of these structures concealed a hinged trapdoor, leading to an underground passage that connected to Henrik's central root cellar through reinforced tunnels. So none of them understood that Henrik had created, in effect, an underground network that allowed him to move from any point on his property to any other point without ever exposing himself to surface conditions. The system was invisible by design. Henrik had learned from his mining background that the most effective safety measures were the ones that did not draw attention to themselves, because attention invited interference, and interference cost time that could mean the difference between survival and death when conditions turned hostile. The completion of the peripheral passage system coincided almost exactly with the end of spring planting season, when Henrik's neighbors were too busy with their own crops to pay much attention to his activities. June passed without incident. July brought the expected heat and the usual concerns about rainfall and grasshoppers. August was unremarkable. September brought the harvest, and Henrik's wheat yields were slightly above average despite his supposed waste of labor on unnecessary excavation. October and November passed in the typical rhythm of Kansas farm life, preserving food, preparing livestock for winter, repairing equipment, stocking supplies. December brought the first snow, and Henrik's passage system proved itself in a minor way when he was able to access his chicken coop, woodshed, and livestock shelter without exposing himself to a blizzard that dropped temperatures to 14 degrees below zero and deposited 18 inches of snow across his claim. His neighbors noticed that his animals remained healthy while several of their own chickens froze in inadequately protected coops. They attributed this to luck or to the Swede's peculiar obsession with preparation, but they did not connect his success to the underground infrastructure that they had mocked the previous spring. Winter passed. February brought a brief thaw, followed by a late freeze that damaged early plantings across the county. March arrived, with the unsettled weather that Kansas residents had learned to associate with tornado season, the collision of cold northern air with warm moisture from the Gulf of Mexico that created the atmospheric instability necessary for severe storm development. Henrik watched the sky with increasing attention as April approached. He had spent the winter months reinforcing his central cellar with additional food stores, water containers, medical supplies, and tools. He had tested each of his 4 exit points multiple times, ensuring that the trapdoors opened smoothly and that the passages remained clear of debris or water infiltration. He had calculated the likely approach angles of tornadoes based on the prevailing storm patterns he had observed during his time in Kansas, and he had positioned his supplies accordingly, with the largest caches in the locations least likely to be affected by a direct strike. The mathematics suggested that a tornado approaching from the southwest, the most common direction, would most likely damage his cabin and the chicken coop while leaving the woodshed and livestock shelter intact. A tornado approaching from the northwest would reverse this pattern. A tornado approaching from due west would potentially damage both the cabin and the woodshed while sparing the chicken coop and livestock shelter. Henrik had arranged his supplies so that critical items were stored in at least 2 locations, ensuring redundancy against any single impact pattern. His neighbors, meanwhile, continued with their established practices, trusting to providence, prayer, and the simple hope that tornadoes would strike somewhere else. The spring of 1887 began with unusual warmth. March temperatures reached 72 degrees on 4 separate occasions, drawing moisture from the soil and encouraging the premature growth of prairie grasses that would normally remain dormant until mid-April. The farmers of Chase County welcomed the warm weather as a sign of an early growing season, but Henrik recognized it for what it was: fuel. The warm air carried moisture from the south, rising and mixing with the cold air that still dominated the northern plains, creating the unstable atmospheric conditions that spawned the most violent storms. Henrik began sleeping in his root cellar on March 28th, descending through the trapdoor each evening and emerging each morning to tend his livestock and monitor the weather. His neighbors noticed his absence from the usual gathering points and assumed he was simply behaving strangely again, the Swede and his peculiar habits, nothing to concern themselves with. What they did not notice was the increasingly ominous pattern of weather that developed over the first 2 weeks of April. Thunderstorms rolled through on April 3rd, 5th, 8th, and 11th, each one more intense than the last, each one spawning high winds that flattened early crops and scattered livestock across the open prairie. The storms were severe enough to cause damage, but not severe enough to prove Henrik's point. That proof would come on April 18th, exactly 2 years after Henrik had watched his first Kansas tornado from his cabin door and understood that the underground was where survivors lived. The day began with an eerie stillness that veterans of Kansas weather recognized as dangerous. The air was warm, 78 degrees by 9 a.m., and saturated with moisture that hung over the prairie like an invisible weight. Henrik checked his passage system at dawn, she confirming that all 4 exit points remained accessible and that his supplies were positioned correctly. He moved his livestock into the shelter early, an unusual decision that drew the attention of Margaret Lindsay, who was passing by on her way to Cottonwood Falls. She stopped her wagon and called out to ask if something was wrong. Henrik pointed to the southwestern horizon, where a line of dark clouds was beginning to form, despite the clear sky overhead. "The storms will be severe today," he said. "I would recommend that you return home quickly and find shelter below ground if you have it." Margaret Lindsay laughed with the confidence of a woman who had survived 15 years of Kansas weather without ever needing to hide from it. "I've seen 100 storms worse than whatever's coming today," she said. "The sky's clear. Dear, there's not a cloud within 10 miles except those little puffs on the horizon. You worry too much, Dahlberg." She continued toward Cottonwood Falls. Henrik watched her go, then descended into his root cellar to wait. The storm system that developed over central Kansas on the afternoon of April 18, 1887, was later estimated to be among the most severe in the territory's recorded history. The collision of air masses produced a line of supercell thunderstorms stretching from Norton County in the northwest to Chautauqua County in the southeast, a distance of approximately 180 miles. The supercells began producing tornadoes shortly after 2 p.m. local time, with the first confirmed touchdown occurring near Phillipsburg at 2:17 p.m. By 4 p.m., at least 7 tornadoes were active simultaneously across the storm line. By 6 p.m., the total count would reach 19, with 12 of those rated as violent based on the damage they produced. The tornado that struck the Cottonwood Falls area touched down at 4:43 p.m., approximately 8 miles southwest of Henrik's claim, and traveled on a northeast trajectory for 37 minutes before lifting near the Neosho River. Its path width was later measured at approximately 400 yards at its widest point, and its estimated wind speed, based on the destruction it caused, exceeded 200 miles per hour. This was not a tornado that could be survived by prayer or luck. This was a tornado that would test every preparation Henrik had made and prove, in the most brutal way possible, whether his mathematics had been correct. Henrik heard the storm approaching before he saw it. The sound began as a low rumble, was similar to distant thunder, but it did not fade as thunder does. Instead, it grew steadily louder, acquiring a higher-pitched component that reminded Henrik of the ventilation fans in the deepest copper mines of Falun. He was in his root cellar at the time, 8 feet below the surface, surrounded by 18 inches of limestone on all sides and 2 feet of packed earth overhead. The sound penetrated even this protection, growing from a rumble to a roar to something beyond description, a noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once and vibrate in his chest rather than his ears. The pressure in the cellar changed abruptly, his ears popping as the air density shifted. The trapdoor above him rattled, then lifted briefly despite its 40-pound weight, and the furniture Henrik had positioned on top of it made dust sifted down from the ceiling beams. The noise reached a crescendo that lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt much longer, and then began to diminish, moving away to the northeast, leaving behind a silence that seemed almost as unnatural as the sound that had preceded it. If these accounts of human ingenuity tested against natural forces resonate with you, I would encourage you to like this video and leave a comment sharing your own experiences with severe weather preparation. The algorithms that govern what content reaches new viewers respond to engagement, and engagement determines whether these stories of practical wisdom continue to reach audiences who might need them. Your interaction with this content is not merely passive consumption, where it is active participation in the preservation and distribution of knowledge that could, in the right circumstances, save a life. Henrik waited 30 minutes after the sound had faded before attempting to exit his cellar. When he finally pushed open the trapdoor, he found that the furniture he had positioned above it was gone. The cabin floor remained, but everything that had been sitting on it had been removed as completely as if it had never existed. Climbing through the trapdoor, Henrik emerged into what had been his cabin and found that only the stone walls remained, rising 4 feet from the foundation before ending in jagged edges where the oak beam roof structure had been torn away. The sod roof was gone entirely. The oak beams were gone. His bed, his table, his chairs, his stove, his stored food, his clothing, his tools, everything that had occupied the above-ground structure was gone, scattered across the prairie or carried miles away by winds that had exceeded anything the human body could withstand. Henrik stood in the ruined shell of his cabin and looked at the exposed root cellar entrance, still intact, still providing access to the underground refuge that had preserved his life. The trapdoor was functional. The stone-lined shaft was undamaged. The ceiling beams that supported the cabin floor above the cellar had held, protected by the limestone foundation that had distributed the tornado's force around the reinforced underground space rather than through it. he moved to examine the rest of his passage system. The connecting tunnel to the east was intact, and he followed it to the chicken coop exit, where he discovered that the coop itself had been destroyed, but the trapdoor remained functional, protected by its position at ground level and the weight of debris that had settled over it. Of his 37 chickens, he found 11 alive in the passage below, having apparently fled down the access shaft when the storm approached. The connecting tunnel to the west led him to the woodshed, which had sustained only minor damage. The roof was partially collapsed, but the structure remained standing and the trapdoor was accessible. All 4 cords of firewood remained in place, protected by the walls that Henrik had reinforced beyond what any neighbor considered necessary. The connecting tunnel to the north led him to the livestock shelter, which was completely destroyed. The trapdoor remained functional, however, and Henrik discovered that one of his dairy cows had somehow descended into the passage, where she stood in apparent confusion, unhurt but clearly distressed by her underground relocation. The other cow and the mule were missing, presumably killed or scattered by the tornado's passage. Henrik would later find the mule a quarter-mile northeast of his claim, alive but injured, having been carried by the winds and deposited in a low spot that had protected her from the worst of the debris. The second cow was never found. The peripheral passage itself was undamaged. Henrik walked its entire perimeter, 144 linear feet of underground corridor, and found no collapses, no structural failures, no points where the tornado's force had penetrated his carefully constructed refuge. The limestone walls had held, the oak beam ceiling had held, while the packed earth covering had absorbed the tornado's energy and redistributed it without transmitting catastrophic stress to the underground structure. The mathematics had worked exactly as Henrik had calculated. His survival was not luck, it was engineering. The situation 3 miles to the northwest was considerably different. William Dunn, the young farmer who had visited Henrik 4 times during the construction of the passage system, each time predicting that the project would fail, had survived the tornado only because he was not home when it struck. He had ridden to Cottonwood Falls that morning to purchase seed for late planting, and the storm had delayed his return by several hours. When he finally reached his claim at approximately 8 p.m., guided by lantern light and the desperate hope that his wife had somehow found shelter, he found nothing. His cabin was gone. His barn was gone. His livestock were scattered dead across a debris field that extended for nearly a mile. His wife, Rebecca Dunn, 24 years old, was found the following morning beneath the wreckage of their root cellar, which had collapsed when the tornado removed the cabin above it. She had sought shelter in the underground space, just as conventional wisdom recommended, but the cellar had not been designed to withstand the loss of its supporting structure. When the cabin was torn away, the cellar walls, earthen, unreinforced, adequate for normal conditions but catastrophically inadequate for violent tornado impact, had given way. She had been buried beneath approximately 3 feet of collapsed soil and broken timbers, conscious for some period of time according to the marks found on the underside of the debris, before dying of injuries that the coroner could not precisely identify. William Dunn would never rebuild on that claim. He sold the land 3 months later and moved to eastern Kansas, where tornadoes were less frequent, and where he never had to look at the spot where his wife had died, trusting the conventional wisdom that Henrik Dahlberg had rejected. The tornado of April 18, 1887, killed 14 people across Chase County. It destroyed 23 homes, 47 barns and outbuildings, and an uncounted number of livestock. It remains to this day the deadliest tornado in the county's recorded history. Among the dead were Marcus Lindsay, the 18-year-old son of Margaret Lindsay, who had been caught in the open while attempting to secure livestock when the tornado struck his mother's ranch. Margaret Lindsay herself survived by lying flat in a drainage ditch and allowing the tornado to pass over her, but the experience broke something in her that never healed. She sold her cattle operation within the year and moved to Kansas City, where she died in 1894 of causes that her obituary listed as natural, but that her friends attributed to the lasting trauma of that April afternoon. Thomas Garrett, the Ohio farmer who had calculated that Henrik was wasting labor on his excavation project, survived the tornado physically unharmed, but lost his barn, his stored grain, and his primary draft horse. He would later tell anyone who would listen that he had been fortunate that the tornado had passed just north of his cabin, one that the Lord had spared him for reasons he could not understand. What he did not mention, at least not initially, was that he had begun construction on an underground passage system of his own before the summer was over. The transformation of community opinion regarding Henrik Dahlberg's construction methods began within days of the tornado's passage. The first visitor was Samuel Hutchins, the Tennessee farmer who had been the first to mock the excavation project 14 months earlier. He arrived on April 21st, 3 days after the tornado, and stood at the edge of the ruined cabin where he had once stood at the edge of the excavation trench. The peripheral passage was visible now, the packed earth covering partially eroded by the tornado's passage, revealing the oak beam ceiling structure beneath. Soon Henrik was in the process of shoveling displaced soil back onto the passage roof when Hutchins arrived. The older farmer watched him work for several minutes without speaking, just as he had watched him work 14 months before. Finally, Hutchins cleared his throat and spoke. "I said tornadoes don't care about your passages," he said. "I recall you said mathematics works every time if the calculations are correct. Appears your calculations were correct." Henrik straightened and leaned on his shovel, just as he had done during their first conversation. "The passage held," he said simply. "The cabin did not. Next time, I will build the cabin stronger, but the passage design requires no modification." Hutchins nodded slowly. "I lost 17 head of cattle and my entire barn," he said. "My house lost its roof, but the walls held. My wife sheltered in the root cellar and survived, but the cellar took water damage that will take weeks to repair. I have been farming Kansas for 8 years. I have never seen a storm like that one. I am not sure I ever want to see another." He paused, seeming to gather himself for what he was about to say. "I would consider it a favor if you would show me how you built that passage system. I am prepared to admit that I was wrong about its usefulness. I would prefer to be prepared for the next storm rather than lucky." Over the following weeks, Henrik Dahlberg received visits from 23 different families, each one seeking to understand the construction methods that had preserved his life and his supplies while conventional structures failed. He showed them his limestone reinforced walls. He explained the mathematics of load distribution that allowed packed earth and stone to resist forces that wooden structures could not withstand. He demonstrated his multiple exit design, emphasizing the importance of redundancy in any survival system. He drew diagrams and provided measurements, and answered questions with the same patient precision he had applied to the original construction. Not everyone was convinced. Some farmers argued that the labor requirements were prohibitive, that they could not spare the time from their agricultural work to dig unnecessary holes around their properties. Some argued that the tornado of April 18th was a rare event, that such severe storms occurred only once in a generation, that preparing for their recurrence was foolish when more immediate concerns demanded attention. But many listened. Many measured. Many began digging. By the autumn of 1887, 7 families in the Cottonwood Falls vicinity had completed peripheral passage systems based on Henrik Dahlberg's design. By the spring of 1888, that number had grown to 15. By 1890, the reinforced underground shelter had become a standard feature of new homestead construction throughout central Kansas, though the design had evolved and simplified as different builders adapted the principles to their specific circumstances. Some built simple storm cellars with reinforced walls and multiple exits. Some built full peripheral passage systems like Henrik's original design. Some built hybrid structures that combined elements of both approaches. What they all shared was the understanding that the underground was where survivors lived when the surface turned hostile. And that survival required planning, preparation, and the willingness to invest labor in protection rather than trusting to luck and providence. Consider subscribing to this channel if you believe that practical knowledge deserves preservation. The algorithms that determine visibility favor channels with consistent subscriber growth, and that visibility determines whether these stories of frontier innovation continue to reach new audiences. I am not asking for your subscription because it benefits me personally. I am asking because the knowledge contained in these accounts, knowledge earned through hardship, validated through crisis, preserved through storytelling, represents something worth maintaining in a world that increasingly forgets how previous generations solved the fundamental problems of survival. Your subscription is a vote for the preservation of practical wisdom over theoretical abstraction. Henrik Dahlberg rebuilt his cabin in the summer of 1887 using the same limestone construction he had employed for his passage system. The new cabin had stone walls 18 inches thick, rising to a full 8 feet, supporting a roof of oak beams covered by stone slabs and packed earth rather than the vulnerable sod, construction that had failed in the tornado. The design was heavier, more expensive, and more labor-intensive than conventional cabin construction, but it was also virtually indestructible by anything short of a direct hit from the most violent tornado. When a second tornado struck the Cottonwood Falls area in May of 1891, traveling within 2 miles of Henrik's claim, his rebuilt cabin sustained no damage whatsoever. The passage system beneath it functioned exactly as designed, providing shelter during the storm's passage and emerging undamaged afterward. Henrik would live on that claim until his death in 1923, surviving an additional 19 tornado seasons without ever needing to evacuate or seek emergency shelter elsewhere. His passage system remained functional throughout that period, requiring only minor maintenance to address water infiltration and settling. When archaeologists from the Kansas State Historical Society excavated the site in 1987, exactly 100 years after the tornado that had validated Henrik's design, they found the peripheral passage largely intact, its limestone walls still standing, its oak beam ceiling still supporting the packed earth above it. The excavation revealed a level of engineering sophistication that surprised researchers who had expected to find simple root-cellar construction. What they found instead was evidence of a systematic approach to underground shelter design that anticipated principles that would not be formally codified until the mid-20th century development of civil defense infrastructure. The direct legacy of Henrik Dahlberg's innovation is difficult to trace with precision because successful innovations tend to become invisible. The reinforced underground shelter became standard practice across tornado-prone regions of the Great Plains, but the specific contribution of one Swedish immigrant in Chase County, Kansas, was not recorded in any official documentation of the practice's development. What the records do show is a pattern of adoption that radiated outward from the Cottonwood Falls area during the late 1880s and early 1890s, reaching neighboring counties by 1890 and spreading throughout Kansas by the turn of the century. The tornado safety literature of the 1900s and 1910s recommended reinforced underground shelters with multiple exits, citing the experience of Kansas settlers who had learned through trial and error which designs worked and which did not. None of this literature mentioned Henrik Dahlberg by name. His obituary, published in the Cottonwood Falls newspaper on March 17, 1923, described him as a successful farmer, a respected member of the community, and a Swedish immigrant who had contributed to the development of Chase County agriculture. It did not mention his passage system. It did not mention the tornado of April 18, 1887. It did not mention that his approach to underground shelter construction had been adopted by hundreds of families across the region, saving an uncounted number of lives in subsequent tornado seasons. The obituary treated Henrik Dahlberg as ordinary, which perhaps he was, in the sense that ordinary people applying careful reasoning to survival problems are the actual source of most innovations that improve human welfare. The modern application of Henrik Dahlberg's principles can be seen in the tornado safe rooms that FEMA began recommending in the 1990s and that have become increasingly common in new residential construction throughout the American Midwest. These safe rooms are typically constructed of reinforced concrete or steel, with walls designed to withstand debris impact from winds exceeding 250 miles per hour. Many incorporate multiple entrance points and ventilation systems that echo the redundancy Henrik built into his peripheral passage system. The mathematics remain the same. The materials have improved. The fundamental insight that survival in extreme weather requires protection that exceeds the standards adequate for normal conditions has not changed since Henrik Dahlberg first applied his Swedish mining experience to Kansas tornado survival in 1886. What has changed is the recognition that such protection is worth the investment. The early settlers of Kansas had to learn this lesson through the deaths of their neighbors and family members. Modern residents of tornado-prone regions have the benefit of that accumulated experience, while codified in building standards and emergency management recommendations that represent the distilled wisdom of generations of people who faced severe weather with inadequate preparation and paid the price. Henrik Dahlberg never sought recognition for his contribution to Kansas settlement. He never patented his passage system design. He never wrote about his construction methods for publication. He simply built what he knew would work, allowed others to observe and copy, and continued living his life on the claim he had purchased in 1884. When neighbors asked why he had been so confident in his design, when the tornado had validated his preparation so thoroughly, Henrik typically offered the same answer he had given Samuel Hutchins on that March afternoon when the excavation began. "That is not luck talking," he would say, "which that is just mathematics. Mathematics works every time. If the calculations are correct, the calculations were correct. I did the work. The work held. That is all there is to understand." His neighbors, who had expected some expression of satisfaction at being proven right, were often disappointed by this response. They wanted vindication to feel like victory. Henrik seemed to experience vindication as simply the expected outcome of correct preparation. Satisfying, perhaps, but not surprising, and certainly not something to celebrate when others had died for lack of the same foresight. The Dahlberg farm remained in continuous operation until 1956, when Henrik's grandson, Eric Dahlberg III, sold the property to a neighboring operation that consolidated several small farms into a larger agricultural enterprise. The peripheral passage system was filled in during the consolidation, its presence inconvenient for the modern equipment that required level ground and unobstructed access. The original cabin foundation remained visible until the 1970s, when it was removed to make way for center pivot irrigation equipment. By the time the Kansas State Historical Society conducted its archaeological survey in 1987, the only physical evidence of Henrik Dahlberg's innovation was the peripheral passage itself, preserved beneath the soil where the consolidation crews had not fully excavated it. The passage had survived for a century, not because anyone had maintained it, but because it had been built well enough to resist the same forces that had destroyed everything above it. And that persistence was perhaps the most appropriate monument to Henrik Dahlberg's approach, invisible, unremarkable, and still functional long after the man who built it and the community that adopted his methods had all passed from living memory. The mathematics of tornado survival have not changed since 1887. What has changed is our willingness to take those mathematics seriously before the tornado arrives. Henrik Dahlberg understood something that many of his neighbors had to learn through tragedy, that preparation is not excessive when the threat is real, that redundancy is not waste when single points of failure can be fatal, and that the wisdom of unconventional approaches is proven not through argument, but through the brutal honesty of extreme conditions. And the neighbors who mocked him were not wrong to question unusual construction methods. They were wrong to assume that their experience represented the full range of what Kansas weather could deliver. The tornado of April 18, 1887, taught them otherwise. Those who survived the lesson applied it. Those who didn't survive became the reason others started digging. Henrik Dahlberg's peripheral passage system looked strange to everyone who saw it during its construction. It looked like excessive labor, like misplaced priorities, like the product of European anxiety transplanted to American soil where such preparations were unnecessary. It kept Henrik Dahlberg alive through the worst tornado season Kansas had experienced since territorial settlement began, preserved his supplies and most of his livestock, and demonstrated that the underground was where survivors lived when the surface turned hostile. The mathematics were correct. The work held. That is all there is to understand.